The voice of the Valley. 24/7. AM 1480 WLEA.
Two guests this week, reporter Tom Osborne in Segment 1, Congressman Tom Reed in Segment 2.
It's time for Top Story on AM 1480 WLEA Hornell. Here's Ryan O'Neill.
The top story this week is the horrible attack of the plane in Ukraine, a situation that must be reminding Americans who are old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when Russia, known as the leading country then of the Soviet Union, sent missiles to Cuba.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
That was President John Kennedy in October of 1962. On the line with us now, former ABC News correspondent, and he's currently with USUN Report in New York City, Tom Osborne. Tom Osborne, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
Tom, does this situation take you back to 1962?
Brian, it certainly does. I was about 12 years old then, and one of those people who hid under the desk, but it certainly reminds me of the dangerous stakes that were at issue then when the Cubans actually had their finger on the trigger when Nikita Khrushchev thought that he had control of those missiles, and the United States might have gotten into a nuclear exchange over the entire situation. I would only add our listeners to pay attention to the chief weapons investigator of the United Nations, Charles Dulfer, who reminded us that there's going to be some serious arguments about whether the Russians were behaving responsibly with respect to their clients, particularly with the aspect of them having access to these types of weapons, which are outside the command and control of an organized state, in an airliner passing through airspace where they have no way of checking to see if this is a civilian aircraft, friend or foe. So this sets us in a very dangerous situation. At last, the Europeans are beginning to pay attention. Angela Merkel of Germany will be taking some responsibility to protect the world from this carelessness. But Putin has played a dangerous game, and he'll have to find a way out of this.
Here's another clip from President Kennedy in 1962. You hear him here really resisting going into war.
Our policy has been one of patience and restraint, as befits a peaceful and powerful nation which leads a worldwide alliance. We have been determined not to be diverted from our central concerns by mere irritants and fanatics.
Irritants and fanatics. He had a way of putting things. Tom Osborne again. Any similarities between today's situation for President Barack Obama, where people are pushing him to take military action, in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962?
Yes, there are, Brian. Of course, both military advisors on either side, the Khrushchev to Kennedy, were pushing for an invasion of Cuba at the time. President Obama has enacted tougher sanctions, not an invasion against the Russians. He did this yesterday for just these irresponsible uses of these dangerous military weapons falling into the hands that should not be out of control. And this exactly reminds us of the Cuban Missile Crisis at that time.
One final clip from President Kennedy.
We have no wish to war with the Soviet Union, for we are a peaceful people who desire to live in peace with all other peoples. But it is difficult to settle or even discuss these problems in an atmosphere of intimidation. That is why this latest Soviet threat, or any other threat, which is made either independently or in response to our actions this week, must and will be met with determination. Any hostile move anywhere in the world against the safety and freedom of peoples to whom we are committed, including in particular the brave people of West Berlin, will be met by whatever action is needed.
Tom Osborne.
Yes, Brian, that reminds me very much of what the Council, the United Nations Security Council, and all member states of the United Nations adopted in 2005 in the wake of the Twin Towers. That was the responsibility to protect. And this clause is invoked when and if a state is a failed state or a state is putting the rest of the international community in jeopardy. This is where we have to consider a particular case in point, that we're seeing right now unfold in the Ukraine.
Tom Osborne of USUN Report. So there were some Americans on that plane. Does that make it an act of war against the U.S.?
It puts everybody on notice. There were several nations involved, including, of course, the Netherlands, one of our allies. And if you recall, President Kennedy made it clear that any attack on any of our allies would require a full retaliatory response. So we're on one side and the Russians are on the other. And as they said back then, we're waiting for somebody to blink.
We're now going back to the present July of 2014. The Hawks are pushing for President Obama to get into war with Russia, but Obama seems to be resisting.
I spoke to President Putin yesterday in the wake of additional sanctions that we had imposed. He said he wasn't happy with them, and I told him that we have been very clear from the outset that we want Russia to take the path that would result in peace in Ukraine, but so far at least Russia has failed to take that path.
Tom Osborne, is President Obama correct in the way he's dealing with Vladimir Putin here?
Yes, I think so, Brian. He's taking one step at a time. And of course, we've called now for an investigation the UN Security Council has in a presidential statement. And that investigation must go forward to once and for all identify who was responsible and who was irresponsible in placing these weapons in uncontrolled situations.
Tom Osborne, you talk about the National Security Council. Just before we went on the air with this interview, you'd put us on hold so you could speak with a source from the National Security Council. Is there anything you can say about that conversation?
I've been in consultation with a source in the Security Council. The Security Council this morning issued a statement by the President. It's not the same as a binding statement, but it basically is a way to ratchet up the pressure on Putin to come forth and to own this situation or prove that it is not him that is responsible.
Before we went on the air, you spoke of how those who want to go to war don't fully understand the capabilities of Putin's military right now.
Well, of course, if it were a failed state, for example, we would be able to intervene, but this is a member state of the United Nations, and so that makes it much more complicated, especially one with veto power. But this particular nation with veto power has been acting irresponsible with over thousands of nuclear missiles arrayed on both sides. And so the United Nations and the United States has to take a careful ratcheting up in the situation. But it will be steadfast, and it will prove who is responsible in the end.
Tom Osborne, those critical of the president have been saying that he's too soft in his rhetoric.
I think he's got just about the right speed. He's put him on notice, and there will be further sanctions if necessary. And so I think he's left himself with lots of room at this point. And that's what every head of state must do, because we don't have much room to play in these days.
Tom Osborne, we're getting down to just a couple of minutes left in this segment. Any final thoughts before we switch over to Congressman Tom Reed?
Well, I just hope that the United States is fine-tuned with the United Nations on this particular point, because this is a particular issue in which the world is waiting for a response. Not just the United States, but the rest of the world who has lost their own in this plane crash. This was a plane 30,000 feet above ground, which was shot down by a strategic missile. That must be sorted out.
USUN Report's Tom Osborne, thank you very much for joining us this weekend.